Good morning. If you will turn with me to Acts, the 21st chapter. Acts, the 21st chapter. We'll start there as we consider the title, A Disciple, with the subtitle, A Disciple Poured Out. Poured out. Poured out. And why is that? Because we are looking at, as we've talked about before, the portion of Acts that shifts in a lot of ways. If we had to put faces on it, even though, as we talked about in class this morning, faces really don't fit unless it's the face of Jesus. One of the studies that I went through talked about how even though he technically leaves and ascends into the clouds in chapter 1, Jesus is the theme throughout the book of Acts, but two prominent faces factor in to the work of the church. One is Peter early on as he begins to fade out around chapters 12 and 15. Finally, Paul, who's also been introduced to us by the time we get to chapter 9, really takes a more prominent role because the last half of the book talks about his missionary journeys, as they're called, 1, 2, and 3. As we look at the third missionary journey this week, starting in chapter 21, poured out is the theme. In a lot of ways, it we'll see more or less in his writings, because the question we looked at this morning in class is, did Paul actually die in Rome? Why? Because he ends up the book in Rome, Acts chapter 28. We said even though he's in prison, he's in a relatively decent environment because he's given liberty and freedom to do the work that God has called him to do. And what's the lesson that we didn't really finish up, since Marcus has a hard time wrapping up points as he strays and rambles? The point we started this morning in class, though, is even in the midst of your struggles, land of Goshen, where is it? The land of Goshen is in Israel, well, in Egypt, carved out for the people of Israel during the days when Joseph had done such favors for the people of Israel, but his people were forgotten and then taken into slavery. When God finally decides he's going to deliver them, the land of Goshen is spared. The historic plagues that we talked about in class. And what's the application? That's what I forgot to make. Is that in your life, as the storms begin to build up, and we've talked about it, maybe it might need to be a theme verse. The God who is able to do exceedingly and abundantly beyond all we ask or think is able to carve out Goshens in your life, whether it is your workplace where things aren't necessarily doing anything other than storming and seeming unstable around you. I seem to remember Paul in this section of scripture. Before he can get to Rome, he gives a piece of advice that should have been taken but was ignored and ended up in shipwreck, right? So I'm sure there have been times in your life where, if you're anything like me, a piece of advice I gave probably shouldn't have been heeded. But then there are those times when I don't get it wrong all the time, right? Nobody listens, and then shipwreck. And it'd be one thing if we could confine our shipwrecks and the effects of those to only those who make the faulty decisions, but they call it collateral damage. Why? Because even though you might have walked the right path, made the right things, and taken the time to try to offer up advice when you know sometimes the backlash to advice is ridicule, you get wrapped up in the shipwreck as well. But even with that, God is able to carve out lands of Goshen for his people. And that's why we talk about faith. We talked about faith being so important this morning because at some point, it simply gives us the opportunity to take a different perspective. We talked about the class that I had such a difficult time finding an end to. But as long as I sat in my seat from my perspective, I was never going to see it. As much as I wrestled with it in my mind, the answer was never going to come as easily as it did when I simply sat in the seat and took the perspective of those who are often burdened with having to listen to what I'm saying. At which point, simply a shift in perspective provided the simple answer that I've been wrestling with for days during that week. So that's what obedience and faith is. It's not just a test of things we see written in the Bible. It is an actual concept that's designed to help lighten our load, which is part of what happens during that shipwreck. Before they actually run aground, they're trying to save their own lives, so things they thought were so necessary, they start tossing over the edge of the ship. And that is so often what the word is calling us to do, except it's saying do it in peacetime. Do you think Paul could have made all of these travels heavily laden? No. It's a man who had to travel light, right? And so in times of peace, oftentimes God is trying to get us to jettison things that seems like we need, but when we really take stock, they're really just become more of a burden. Like I talked about, I got to move soon. I pride myself on traveling light. In just this amount of time, I'm exceedingly annoyed at the number of things I have to pack and get rid of. And you probably heard, preacher doesn't keep a lot because he's too lazy to clean, right? But you can still accumulate a lot of stuff in a short amount of time. But it's these times in life when sometimes the adversity sets in and all those things God couldn't convince us to get rid of. All of a sudden, when life is at stake, you think it took them a lot of time to debate on what they're going to get rid of? It was easy to throw away. But faith allows us to get rid of things that are simply sometimes a burden in peacetime. We don't have to wait for the storms to toss the boat and God's wisdom to become obvious when it's a life or death issue. So with that, as we are in Acts 21, Paul is going to Jerusalem, as it begins in verse 1. And when he parted from them, and that's the elders at Ephesus, he set sail, we came by a straight course to Kos, and the next day to Rhodes, and from there to Patara. And having found a ship crossing to Phoenicia, we went aboard and set sail, and we had come to sight of Cyprus. Leaving it on the left, we sailed to Syria, in the land of Tyre, for there the ship was to unload its cargo. And having sought out the disciples, we stayed there for 7 days. And through the Spirit, they were telling Paul not to go on to Jerusalem. And when our days were ended, we departed and went on our journey, and they all, with wives and children, accompanied us until we were outside the city. Stop there. We've talked about it before. Many of these stories are told from the perspective of the apostles who endured the hardship, but who all is affected? It is everyone who participates in this ministry. In class, we talked about it. Jason's hospitality caused him to be dragged into the court, and they couldn't get their hands on Paul, the leader of the synagogue. Same thing, the effects. These people had families, even if it's just the effect. Most of them weren't like Paul. They weren't single people traveling. What happens when that household is left behind? You have to agree to partner in that work, and agreeing to partner in the work means agreeing to partner in the suffering, the difficulties, the hard times. And these are often the stories that are left out. But we talked about it before. The word talks about at the end of days, there are some who are last who will be first, and some who are first who will be last. And so just because my name might be prominently mentioned in the story now doesn't mean that's the way it is for eternity. We don't know what it's going to look like in eternity when that passage is fulfilled. He will give each according to their works. And so there are some people who may seem relatively nameless in these stories who have great rewards ahead for them. Please take note for your own life. We talked about it before. It's not always the case that we are going to be in a prominent role in the workplace, society in general. Society might seem like it's put us in a place where we are fixed into a place where credit is always going to go everywhere else until it has to fall on us. That's just the way it is. It's one thing to deal with it for a day, right? It's another thing when you're just fixed in that circumstance. I told you there was a comedian who told the joke about why he hated Apple. Not Apple, but why he hated Steve Jobs. He's like, I hate Steve Jobs. Why? Because there's some guy in the basement of Apple who simply listened to Steve Jobs say, get it done, who's sacrificing his life to get it done. Does anybody thank him? Do you even know his name? I can't even name his name for this joke. Why? Because he is a, quote unquote, cog in the wheel of an otherwise extremely successful organization who is fixed into a position where he doesn't simply do a thankless job one day. That's in a lot of ways his or her life. So it's one thing to have to deal with it on an occasional basis, but when your life is fixed in a spot where the ship doesn't move forward if you ain't doing your job, but the thanks is always going everywhere else, it can get pretty frustrating, right? But at the end of the day, that's the situation in which the early church was started. Paul didn't get to Rome if it's not for these folks, or it's pointless to get to Rome if he doesn't have folks who are going to listen. So by the time we've gotten there, our brothers already read the passage. There are people who are welcoming him there. And ultimately, those nameless people, we don't know how their story ends, and we don't know what their reward will be, even though their press clippings might not be all that substantial now. One of the things to notice, though, is really three things about Paul's final days in Rome. And a lot of the studies I've read suggest that Rome was his final stop in life. I'm not completely sure that's the case. And we talked about it this morning. It's so important to try to aspire, even if we're not great at it, to live up to that credo, to speak where the Bible speaks and be silent where the Bible is silent. The Bible does not say that this was Paul's last stop. As a matter of fact, there are some passages in the way he addresses the Romans in his epistle that suggest that he had already been there before, even though early on in the first chapter he says, I've longed to see you. It doesn't say I long to meet you. It says I long to see you. But the things that he writes to them sounds much like the kinds of things he would say to churches in which he's seen the same kind of division that you're going to see at the end of the book of Acts. These are people who originally welcomed him well, but the backlash to his success in the synagogue created a division. And in many ways, the book of Romans deals with this whole division between Jew and Gentile. And so that's not at all what you see. And of course, I'm getting ahead of myself. As we, since I'm talking about it, let's turn forward to his reception in Acts 28. That's not at all what you see in his reception. There's no division that he's dealing with in his early meeting. As a matter of fact, by the time he gets to chapter 11 in Romans, we've talked about it before in dealing with the different issue. He's looking at it from the perspective of Israel, people who are thinking that Israel is now lost. That's not the way he's greeting them, or he's greeted when he goes and starts at the synagogue in Acts chapter 28. Let's start in verse 20. And the context for verse 20 is Paul is now in Rome. He has been pretty much accustomed to the pattern that we talked about in the week before. Preaching breeds opposition, brings persecution. And many times the persecution came from synagogues in previous towns like Thessalonica chasing him around the region. So everywhere he went, it wasn't necessarily the synagogue in the place where he was, Berea or Athens, that was the problem. It was the folks who were chasing him from previous missions. And so he's expecting the same thing in Rome, but he's surprised at the response of the synagogue in Rome in verse 20, where it reads, chapter 28, verse 20, for this reason, therefore, I have asked to see and speak with you, since it is because of the hope of Israel that I am wearing this chain. Verse 21, and they said to him, we have received no letters from Judea about you, and none of the brothers coming here has reported or spoken any evil about you. But we desire to hear from you what your views are. For with regard to this sect, we know that everywhere it is spoken against. They're eager to hear. Now, later on, we're going to read there's a division that arises. Verse 23, when they had appointed a day for him, they came to him at his lodging in great numbers. Once again, in greater numbers. That's consistent with what we saw through his first and second missionary journeys. They showed up in numbers to hear him, even in the synagogues and the amongst both the Jews and the Gentiles. Continuing on, though, from morning till evening, he expounded to them, testifying to the kingdom of God and trying to convince them about Jesus, both from the law of Moses and the prophets. And some of them were convinced by what he said, but others disbelieved. And that's where our brother left off this morning. And disagreeing among themselves, they departed after Paul had made one statement. This is the portion we read from class this morning. The Holy Spirit was writing, saying to your fathers through Isaiah the prophet, go to this people and say, you will indeed hear but never understand. You will indeed see but never perceive. For this people's heart has grown dull, and with their ears they can barely hear. Hold on right there. We talked about the role of Isaiah, but just keep going to the very next page. How is he addressing the Romans in his letter to the Romans? Is he talking about folks who sounds like, or who it sounds like he's meeting for the first time back in verse 20 or so? Or is it sounding like these are folks he's talked to before? I can't go through the whole thing, but chapter 1 ends up with that famous passage about those who suppress the truth. Skipping down to verse 32, though they know God's decree that those who practice such things and deserve to die, they not only do them, but give approval to those who practice them. Paul, why are you talking to them so harshly if you've never met them before? Verse 1 of chapter 2, therefore you have no excuse, O man, every one of you who judges, for in passing judgment on another, you condemn yourself, because you, the judge, practice the very same things. And skipping down, not to make too long at this point, because this is a side point, which I struggle to rein in. Verse 17, but if you call yourself a Jew and rely on the law and boast in God and know his will and approve what is excellent because you are instructed from the law, and if you are sure that you yourself are a guide to the blind, a light to those who are in darkness, an instructor to the foolish, a teacher to children, having the law and the embodiment of knowledge and truth. Verse 21, you then who teach others, do you not teach yourselves? While you preach against stealing, do you steal? You who say that one must not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You who abhor idols, do you rob temples? You who boast in the law, dishonor God by breaking the law. For as it is written, the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. This isn't his first time going there. We're being engaged with those people, right? So this looks like what picks up after what we see in the book of Acts. And I can't say it because we speak where the Bible speaks and we try our best to stay silent where it is silent. But it sounds like he's been there before, right? And so what we're seeing is what it looks like for on the end of a ministry to have to go back, like we see the epistle structure. The Acts were these men going around trying to plant works that they didn't have time to stay at, but had to simply go back and counsel through letters and correspondence that were shared amongst the churches later on. And for Paul, it looks like this. In his tone, he has a tone of rebuke. But before this, he's going to have an opportunity to learn humility. Why? Because before he rebukes this congregation, the congregation in Rome, we've talked about before how he rebuked Simon Peter publicly. And in the letter to the Galatians, he specifically says, with regard to Titus, we didn't yield to them for a moment. But he doesn't mention Timothy. What happened with Timothy, Paul? Well, they had Timothy circumcised because, oh, wait a minute, like Titus, he was a Greek. And so all of that happens before, or in many ways, some of it's contemporaneous or at the same time as what happened with Peter. And it just seems like, okay, like we said before, sometimes when I'm retelling my story, I lean a little bit more into the parts that are more favorable, if not, at least the ones that aren't making me look so bad. But see, it's hard to keep that image up when by the time you get to chapter 21, the same James before whom Paul accuses Peter of buckling, not because James showed up, as we said in Galatians personally, but he simply sent men to the region that caused Peter to change his course. Now, Paul has to face James himself in that territory. In chapter 21, in verse 17 beginning, when we had come to Jerusalem, the brothers received us gladly. On the following day, Paul went with us to James, and all the elders were present. After greeting them, he related one by one the things that God had done among the Gentiles through his ministry. And when they heard it, they glorified God and said to him, "You see, brother, how many thousands there are amongst the Jews of those who have believed. They are all zealous for the law. And they have been told about you that you teach all over the Jews who are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children or walk according to our customs. What then is to be done? They will certainly hear that you have come. Do therefore what we tell you." Pause there. What was Paul telling Peter not to do? Wasn't he encouraging him not to live one way amongst the Gentiles and then another amongst the Jews? See, I rarely hear this passage taught, but let's find out how Paul responds. What does Paul respond, or how does Paul respond when he's specifically told what to do by the same circle of folks from James? Verse 23. Therefore, do what we tell you. We have 4 men who are under a vow. Take these men and purify yourself along with them and pay their expenses so that they may shave their heads. For what reason? Thus, all will know that there is nothing in what they have been told about you, but that you yourself also live in observance of the law. There is no mistaking what he is doing here. He is making this change so he can appear as though he lives still as a Torah observant Jew, even though he's criticized Peter for doing the exact same thing. See, this is hard to read if we forget that Paul is human, right? And it's one of those reasons why it's so important to, in that whole call to walk worthy, to walk in humility. Can I criticize Paul? No, because most of what I know in the way of character building behavior comes from the things that he's written. But we said it during class and we've said it before. There's only one hero to this story. And so when I'm rebuking and whipped up into a frenzy of what everybody needs to do, I gotta remember, we've said it before, I've still got some growing to do too. It's reminded me so much of what David dealt with. We talk about it over and over again. We was the man in front of Goliath, right? great victory that led to his kingship. But when he had to actually go see Goliath's people, it was a different story. When Paul was dealing with Peter on Gentile soil, he was a different man than when he was dealing with the sect of the Christians at that time that came from James. He was a different man when he was dealing with a portion of that squad as opposed to when he was playing on their soil. And so let's keep reading to see what he actually did in order to make it appear as though he was living in observance of the law. Verse 25, but as for the Gentiles who have believed, we have sent a letter with our judgment that they should abstain from what has been sacrificed to idols and from blood and from what has been strangled and from sexual immorality. Then Paul took them in, and the next day he purified himself along with them and went into the temple, giving notice when the days of purification would be fulfilled and the offering presented for each of them. It doesn't go so well from there. Why? Because after he picks up from having offered the sacrifice and presented himself as a Torah observant Jew, he goes into the temple, and if you've ever been in a situation where you wanted to kind of lay low, but you just couldn't. Why? Because he'd been preaching all around, and the word was he'd been doing this everywhere. And lo and behold, there they are, some of his friends from previous travels. What are you guys doing here? Telling on you. So you can go through all the ceremonial rituals you want. You can do all the things to clean up the appearance and the PR right now. We know what you were doing in Asia, and that's what we came to testify to now. So understand how this story ends. This isn't a situation where he's able to change his appearance, the PR, the spin, my web image, right? And have it all go away. What he's been doing is what he's now going to have to stand on. And this is the thing. Understand. What's the application? Maybe it's already obvious. One of the reasons why it's so important to try to abide by what Paul is going to write in so many of his letters, to walk worthy, is when the persecution sets in, when the adversity sets in, we can at least have the confidence that if I got to go, if it has to turn south, if it has to go bad now, I at least don't have any regrets about the way I did it, right? I'm not going to be proud about my mistakes, my sins, my shortcomings. That's why I make confession a part of my ministry, right? That's why I try to make repentance a part of what I do. Because woven into my successes are the stories of my failures. You probably heard the famous Michael Jordan story. I've missed over and over again the game-winning shot. I can't count the number of times I was called on to succeed because I was that guy and I just didn't come through. But those famous shots in the finals are all attached to all those failures, because those failures drove me back to the gym when nobody was there. So I could put myself in that situation in which I failed before, hoping that one day I'd get the opportunity again, not to let it go south again. So at some point when it was on my shoulders to do the right thing and people were trusting me again, I could do what was necessary to actually be ready. And so that's why sometimes it's so important for our failures to be involved in our stories. Why? Because there is only one hero to this story. And part of people being able to imitate us as we imitate Christ, we talked about it before, is being able to imitate our recovery. If all we're doing is projecting an image of success, I promised I wasn't going to do it because my brother mentioned stuff for me. But when I was a youth minister, I guess I've been talking about him a long time. So we were using Stephen as an illustration because, yeah, every now and then. But one of the young ladies who plays basketball, she was like, I just wish they'd show him miss because he misses, right? We all miss. And that's the thing about a highlight reel. A highlight reel is us at our best. When I'm telling my story, it's typically the highlight reel, right? But a highlight reel is good for me. Highlight reel ain't necessarily good for my brother or sister who's out there struggling. They need to see it all, right? Not the gory details, but they need to see the story of how I've put away, or I'm at least trying to put away, those parts of my character that are a struggle, that are just toxic, right? Hopefully, toxic is one of those words that's kind of cliche. Hopefully I'm not going too far. That some people are like, Marcus, why do you talk about yourself so bad sometimes? I was like, I put it on me because I know my sins better than anybody else's. But you don't want to exaggerate either your successes or your failures. But those parts of my character that I'm not proud of, hopefully I'm able, like these stories about, like we talked about before, Peter and now Paul this week, we can see this other side of Paul's character, not necessarily being so courageous, as an indication of what it's like for even Paul to have an off day and not have that be the end of his story. See, because it's one thing to look at Paul as a hero, but it's another thing to look at Paul as sometimes just like me, being the person who's harder on others than I am on Marcus, right? Because it's so easy to talk about your flaws, so hard to talk about mine. And so we realize in Paul, who basically is responsible for most of the literature of the New Testament, it's important to see him in a weak moment. Is he going to stop there? No. Why? Because as we said before, I put the kind of the story in the reverse order, but by the time we get to him actually making it out of Jerusalem to Rome, what's happening is he hadn't given up. He's like, okay, yeah, maybe that wasn't such a good look in Jerusalem, but God has promised that I need to go forward to Rome. So I still got a little bit of work left to do. But let's look at one thing that we also need to possibly also pay attention to. And this was not in the plan, so I might have to look for the passage as we kind of kill time. So I want to actually read it instead of just telling the story. Because what ends up happening as they set sail for Rome, as we kind of mentioned in passing during class time, is Paul is going to give them a warning about when to sail. And even though Paul is not necessarily in their profession, if he is really discerning in the true spirit of God, sometimes it's important to be able to take advice wherever it comes from. And so if I, back in the days when I was specializing in playing football or whatever, right? I might not necessarily want to take advice from somebody who's not a football player or coach or scout. What do you know about the path I'm on or what I'm trying to do? Well, there are some things that transcend skill sets and just deal with character. And so ultimately, even though I may not be listening to a specialist, there is a reason why sports psychologists aren't necessarily experts in the X's and O's of a particular sport, but they are sometimes integral in helping athletes who are experts often in the X's and O's get over the humps that are keeping the X's and O's from falling into place. They don't have to be experts in the field. They know that there are certain psychological principles that transcend every athletic endeavor, and not just athletics, life in general. So you have to be able to listen to people who have expertise outside of your field because they may be able to empower what you do. It's the same thing that Paul is dealing with here as a preacher and a scholar who's giving these sailors advice on when to sail. They're like, I'm not trying to hear it. And I can't necessarily say that they say it that way. But in chapter 27, let's just start at verse 21. I might not find a perfect starting point, but let's pick up after Paul has given the advice and he's reflecting. Sometimes it's hard to pass on the temptation to be like, I told you so. And so Paul here says, since they had been without food for a long time, Paul stood up among them and said, men, you should have listened to me and not have set sail from Crete and incurred this injury and loss. Yet I now urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life from among you, but only of the ship. For this very night there stood before me a man, an angel of God, to whom I belong and whom I worship. And he said, do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar, and behold, God has granted you all those who sail with you. So take heart, men, for I have faith in God that it will be exactly as I have been told. But we must run aground on some island. Is that exactly what Paul told him to do? No. Paul told him not to sail because he thought it was going to be a voyage that resulted in not only the loss of the ship, but loss of life. And so understand there's a difference between this whole concept of spiritual discernment and actual prophetic vision. And that's what we're getting to see here. See, Paul's discernment it's not clear he was wrong, but it didn't turn out that way. It could have been the fact that Paul told them this is going to result in the loss of life and ship, and that's exactly what would have happened if God had not simply shown them mercy. Or it could be that Paul had a kind of a hazy idea of what was happening, what was going to happen. It was properly discerned in the spirit, but it wasn't a full prophetic revelation. He didn't get that till later. And that's another thing we have to learn as people of God. The difference between the word of God and our spiritual inclinations. If we are functioning in the spirit, God willing, we're crowding out every other voice but the spirit. But sometimes spiritual discernment can lead us in a general direction that lacks picture perfect clarity. And we always have to be willing to compare that leaning, even when it comes from the Holy Spirit, to actual facts. And that's what happens when he gets the prophecy afterward. It doesn't mean we discard the baby with the bathwater. It doesn't mean we quench the spirit. The word specifically says, do not quench the spirit. But we don't simply rely on spiritual guidance as our alpha and omega. It's a tool in the spiritual toolbox. And so what Paul does is he's perfectly humble once he gets an actual revelation of what's going to happen from a messenger of God to adjust what he's told them. Why is that important? We talked about it before. Sometimes when I get out there and I speak too strongly on what's on my heart or my feelings, I can go too far and I can be reluctant to walk that back. But understand how a mature servant of God is perfectly willing to walk it back when he's gone too far. And that's one of the things it's hard for me to do, right? It's one of the reasons why I keep my mistakes list. I don't just store it and cling to it and mourn and be like, I wish I had said that. But I use it as a checklist for things I need to come back and talk to you all about that I said wrong or didn't get right. Like when I'm fumbling for passages I didn't originally plan to preach from, right? It increases the opportunity for me to get it wrong, right? So you keep a list because you have to be willing to walk it back when you get it wrong. And so why is that so much easier for me to do? It's easier for me to do when I see the guy who wrote most of the New Testament doing it. So that goes back to that whole principle of getting to see both the good and the bad in the ministry, right? Not just the highlight reel, but the oops. And sometimes the oops doesn't have to be all that big, right? But that's the thing. In the position of authority, we talked about it before. The limelight comes with honor when it goes well, but the honor brings the responsibility of fixing public mistakes publicly. And that's not always what I want to do. And so that's one of the things balance and maturity creates is to the degree I want the spotlight, I have to be willing to embrace the heavier burden of confessing and making mistakes publicly, right? Because that ain't as easy. We talked about it this morning. One of the reasons why it's so important to become accustomed or hopefully a person who is perceived as being approachable with mistakes is because if I don't look properly enough in the mirror, I can walk around and people can see me, shirt kind of half untucked for an illustration in their head. That's a little extreme, but you get it. It can be tough for folks to tell you. And sometimes we said the worst feeling is coming back at the end of the day, day's nice and worn out. You look in the mirror and I was like, really? All day, Marcus? All day, right? All day, right? Because it's not always comfortable for people to approach us. And so one of the reasons it's so important to try to be approachable is so that people can help you stop it early before it has to be a huge public error. Because the pressure to walk back a private error is a lot easier and a lot lighter than walking back the public ones. And so a lot of times it's just like when Jesus asked the James and John on the eve of his death. They're like, let one of us sit on your right hand and another on the other. It's like, can you drink the cup? You're talking about the honor. Can you drink the cup? Yes, we can. Okay, you will. Still can't give you the chair, but you asked for it, right? And so that's what it's like. A lot of times we think of the honor that comes along with a public position, but we don't necessarily know or think toward the responsibility on the front end. It's the word we talked about before in Hebrew, aharit, the end of things and the final end, a word that's often associated with their prophetic visions for either the end of a particular age or the end of things beginning. We said it would have been probably so much easier for David to say no if he would have seen Bathsheba through the lens of Absalom on the roof of his house with his concubines. I can't imagine she would have been as overwhelming if he would have seen the aharit at the beginning. But one of the reasons why it's so important to latch into God is because it says he keeps that perspective of seeing the end of a thing from the beginning. And so those times when I am intoxicated with the appeal of a certain position or a certain thing and overwhelmed with the emotion of the moment, one of the reasons why, once again, it's important to stay anchored in God is because he sees without being encumbered by the emotion of the moment. See, he still feels. He still empathizes. He still knows what it's like to struggle and want. Why? I'm guessing a person who spent 40 days in the wilderness with no food knows what it's like to want. I'm guessing I'm not the only one who spends too much time about sometimes wanting to get married. He was 33 and we think, oh, he just dealt with that. That was okay. No. I'm guessing he had to understand discipline, right? There are some things that he wanted that he just traded in for something better. And so it's not so much that he can't emotionally relate to the things we need. It's that he can both emotionally relate to the things that we need and help us see what it's like to not allow our emotions to cause us to stumble. And so that's what the faith is based on. An idle faith, an empty faith that's based on no facts is worthless. But we have a person whose life is described for us as kind of like that employee of the month. You see it on the board, right? A lot of times we want to be that person. I was watching a documentary about some kids toward the end of school. One of them, he seemed like, he just wasn't all that focused and serious. But when they followed him to his job, he was like employee of the month. Like, that guy? Really? So we strive for that, right? Because sometimes the purpose of putting employee of the month up on the board is for people to see, okay, you work with this person every day. Now, it's one thing if they simply cut corners and politic to get their name up on the board. But it's another thing if you know their work ethic, you know when they get here, you know what they produce, and it's a straight line to that board that says employee of the month. That says that company is putting that person up there because this is an example of what makes us successful. Actually, that's the kind of person, if you really think about it, who makes your job easier. Because we talked about Jerry Jones, the Dallas Cowboys. There used to be, I can't remember, it was Deion Sanders, the Deion Sanders commercial he was in. He's like, if 12 men like, or is there 20-something men like that, I could rule the world, right? Because like there's one Deion, right? But if you had 21 people or however many you need to fill out a roster, with people who looked at life, not necessarily for what Deion ended up being, but what it took to actually be Deion or successful in any field, then your workplace would look a lot different because not everybody comes there with the same attitude, right? And so that's the concept of a Jesus. Why do we need God? Well, we need a God because at the end of the day, you got to have something. like I hear it simply stated, there's got to be something more than this. No matter what kind of heaven you can carve out for yourself here, there has to be something more than this. Talked about it on the mission field. No matter how large a house you can get, because we talked about it, sometimes it's easier to live large in a place with an extremely small economy. That's one of the things we can feel as Americans going over to different places. But what's the flip side? You gotta watch your stuff constantly. Or you gotta know that there's somebody looking out for it for you. Because the compassion of the people in those places is giving you a pass that they don't necessarily give everybody. And so even in this environment, if you can create a personal fortune, you still got to secure it. Because whether or not you go to the third world, we talked about it before, cybercrime is a perpetual. This morning I was watching, I forgot about the Sony hack back in 2014. You remember about it? Yep, I didn't either. But we got somebody who did. Sony got hacked not too long ago. You think Sony worries about its security? How much less me as an individual? But they still got hacked. And people are talking, no, it had to be North Korea. They talked to the actual hackers. They're like, no, that could be 4 guys bored on a weekend, right? Because if you're not careful, that's just how insecure an environment we live in. So no matter what legacy you can build here, the wisdom of God stands strong. What does it profit if you gain the whole world and lose your soul? Why? Because it's never going to be secure here. There's always going to be an avenue through which someone can attack it or take it. That's why we need a God. So why did the God decide to actually come and live with us when we said before he could have simply given us an easy button salvation? It's because he is understanding that same thing that employers understand when they show you an employee of the month. There are certain people through whom we can not only improve the quality of life of this organization, but if you really think about it, you as an individual are better because of the way this person works, and we would all be better if you would walk in those steps. So now after I've given Paul all of this grief, we have to realize it's much like Michael Jordan. These weren't the last shots that he took. He went on, and it seems in the New Testament to have written most of the New Testament. And most of that is just like we talked about early in Peter's ministry. Seemed like he was just on a hot streak. He couldn't take an L. He seemed like he couldn't lose. Well, Paul seemed to come after this, where in a lot of ways, most of these letters just seem like he's in a zone filled with the Spirit, unable to lose. But as we said it before, if the foundation of the house is built firm, it's more likely to stand to the end. It's literally what Jesus said as he closed out the Sermon on the Mount. Build your house on the rock, not on the sand. And so understand that how sometimes even your adversity, much like the storms we saw Paul endure, your tough times now are sometimes the building of a foundation that will endure. And that is the bright side. Even though the bright side can seem really cheesy, when you're going through it right now, we've talked about it before, that whole concept of when it says some who are last will be first and some who are first will be last. I always used to resent my difficult times without regard to thinking of the strength that it was building in me. Nobody goes to the gym and expects to lift a weight without breaking a muscle fiber. That's the whole concept. If you have to explain it, the whole point of working out is hurting yourself. That's it. Because your body physically only grows stronger after a reasonable amount of injury. We're not talking about broken bones. We're not talking about, ACLs and Achilles injuries. We're talking about that regular amount of injury that your body needs to grow. Understand your spirit. We say we get it in the physical so much more quickly. It's an assumption in the physical that I got to run and hurt my body, or I got to lift and hurt my body to grow stronger. But then when I got to see a young man who did really well in college football for a while. It's like, that kid is yoked, we call it, right? But even if you're born like that, it doesn't take very long for that to go away if you don't hurt yourself enough to build the right foundation. And so we run from pain in the spiritual, but we run to pain in the physical. And sometimes that is a red flag for where our minds are actually at, because we get it. How I build a physical presence is just so foreign to the way I want to build my spiritual presence, when God has given us these physical bodies, not as the point, but as a simple illustration of spiritual things. And so sometimes when I'm going through it, it's important for me in a church to have brothers and sisters who remind me that just like I go to that gym and spend way too much time probably wasting it at my age, the reason I do that is because I'm building a foundation. And when we're going through it, that is what God is. We said it before, the suffering ain't the point. The suffering is him simply building us a house that will endure. And we talked about ministries this morning. I'm not going to repeat them because I don't like dogging other ministries. But ministries that were huge at one point, but they fell because their foundation wasn't firm, right? We see it with companies. Where's Bear Stearns now? What's Bear Stearns? Okay, I'll tell you. I have to tell you because at 2008, they were huge, right? Certain point in 2008, things fell apart. And our sisters who do finance can give us better insight. But they weren't the only one. In 2008, America's economy went through a seismic shift where people were basically picking and choosing which too big to fail organizations were going to have to fail for us going forward. And so that's basically what we're looking at here. Are we building a foundation that, aside from the cliche, too big to fail, is really attached in the one who can say, this is too big to fail? And that's why we have a God for those who say, there is no God. Why do you need a mythological thing to make yourself feel better? Maybe they're right. But in reality, we all know that there are forces and powers larger than us. Even if you don't believe in a God, I'm pretty sure you don't have to live very long before you believe in a devil, because you see evil all around you, right? And if you know that there is an evil, then if you just take a moment to pause, then you have to realize that as bad as it is, it could be a lot worse. And what is that thing standing between however bad it is right now and however bad it could be? And our brother can tell you, all you got to do is buy yourself a plane ticket to some of these countries where it ain't going so good. If you really want to see how bad it can get. I was thinking about it this morning. I despised some of the hard times I had overseas, but I never would have understood, we've said it before, how bad things can get if I hadn't gotten out of my own experience to realize that there is someone who is standing in between the gap of however bad I'm feeling right now and how bad it really could be. That is God in our belief system. Ultimately, here's the thing. What role does he have in our lives right now? God willing, like we talked about with that whole concept of the employee of the month, God willing, he's simply giving us Jesus and Paul and Peter and all these people who are willing to look bad, even in spite of, I'm sure they shared the same desire as we did, to look like the hero of the story. Saw Peter rebuked by Paul, and Paul, not too long after that, looking a whole lot like the Peter he rebuked. Don't be ashamed when we stumble, and sometimes our stumbles require public change or public confession. Why? Because if we get outside of ourselves to realize, wait a minute, there's somebody else who may be encouraged by me standing up and being like, look, I screwed up and I did it wrong. That courage is the kind that can spread, and that's in many ways, that's how the book of Acts was basically driven forward. It was people who were encouraged by people who they saw as former, I don't want to call them cowards, I don't want to go too far, but people who abandoned Jesus, right? Finding the courage to move forward, and that spread throughout the church. What does that mean for us? Acts 29. There is no 29th chapter of Acts unless you consider that to be us. There's some the unfortunate parts of Christianity I don't want to embrace. But if I'm getting outside of myself and I'm thinking there's somebody else who may be able to be helped by my public demonstration of humility, maybe it can be easier for me to embrace those rougher parts of Christianity. So my prayer for you is my prayer for me, that we all be encouraged by Paul, not only in his highs, but in his lows, so that we can be more courageous in being straightforward representations of what a Christian should be.